Andy, Courtney, and Martin, thank you very much for presentations. The panel is now open to questions. Please use the microphones. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions regarding the practicalities of how to use these approaches. So please feel free to come forward to the microphones. I'm just going to ask one quick question, maybe to all of you in the panel, as a clinical trialist. One of the big limitations that we have, two of the big limitations that we have for successful enrollment in a clinical trial is having enough tissue for a diagnosis, which can be quite difficult in cholangiocarcinoma. And secondly, patients who are really not able to be fit enough, so the performance status isn't quite good. And one of the difficulties is that looking at a case in terms of scan reports and blood reports doesn't really transfer across how fit somebody is. So are you able to address some of those issues in your in various databases?
One of the functions that Trial Explorers has is a function where patients can get on there and talk about their experience. And I think this would be a good opportunity for someone who's interested in a particular trial to go on there and say, hey, listen, this is what we experienced when we did this trial, so be aware that they're going to be asking you this, they're going to be asking you that. But, you know, in terms of seeing if they're physically capable of participating in the trial, at this point, Trials Explorer would only be able to do it via what someone else has said, what kind of comment they have left. And I often think of when it comes time to go eat at a restaurant or to watch a movie or to buy a product online, we're quick to read the customer reviews. And that helps us drive our decision. But we don't do that with clinical trials. Something that our life may depend on, we don't dialogue, we don't talk sideways. And perhaps having a platform where people can do that may be able to partially address that issue.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, actually, do I press the button to speak, or do I just
go ahead, you're on.
All right, cool. So I can probably talk to both of the questions. First is about testing when there isn't tissue available. The technology for liquid biopsies has really been improving tremendously, both for cell-free DNA, that's DNA that's just being shed from tumors all the time, and circulating tumor cells, which are cells that fall off your tumor and circulate around in your blood. And Cure Forward in particular is partnered with Personal Genome Diagnostics, for instance, is a place that we send people for cell-free DNA testing. And then in certain kinds of cancer, we send people to Synvenio for circulating tumor cell testing. On the other question about a patient's readiness to participate in a clinical trial, actually, we like to think of it, or we have been thinking about it, as kind of patient when they sign up is ready, willing, and able. And the problem is that they're not really ready yet. They're willing, they've raised their hand, but there's a lot of work to do to build up that molecular profile and that clinical profile. So we need to help them get able at the same time that to get ready, at the same time that their ability, their ableness is declining. And that's why one of the very first things I said is that it's a race. Often we find that patients who arrive at our service are often too far along, that it's at a point where we're just not able to help anymore, unfortunately. And then there's a lot of patients who come by who are actually doing very well, and they're not really eligible for clinical trials right now. And we have to handle that too. We help them build up their profile just in case there is a time. But it's those people in the middle that we're racing to make sure that they're ready before they're less able.
Thank you. Courtney, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, thank you. two things. One of the reasons we decided right off the bat to connect patients with a clinical trial navigator, and you stay with the same navigator through basically for as long as you're using our service and want to keep searching or keep getting updates, is that those are two parameters, tissue availability or performance status, which is how a clinical trial talks about it. How able are you to participate in a clinical trial, to show up for visits, to even, your body to process the drugs. Those are concepts that you wouldn't have any reason to know unless you were considering clinical trials and working with your doctor. So one of the first things that's going to happen when you speak with an emerging med clinical trial navigator is they're going to fill out a profile with both your clinical and your genomic information on it, and then have conversations like that and make sure you understand in our questionnaires and the forms in which we use to gather this information, spell out those issues so that we're not going to say that you're ready or not ready for something, but we're certainly going to help you understand the concepts and help you understand how to talk to the trial site about those kinds of conversations. One of the things, performance status is a tricky one. If you're not physically able to go on a clinical trial today, is it because you're recovering from treatments and surgeries and other kind of side effects, and you expect to get a little bit better, or and that's not something that folks generally understand. And if you just ask somebody, is this patient able to to walk around, to walk into a visit, it's not something we're going to know the answer to, and it's probably the kind of point in a clinical trial kind of screening that's probably best had with the patient and the clinical trial site. But we want to make sure patients and families understand what those conversations are going to be like. So that would be one of those points. Second part about your tissue is one of the little secrets there, and I suspect many of you may have known that. It's certainly difficult if you can't get enough tissue out of a surgery or a biopsy. That's tough. That's tricky. Liquid biopsies are sort of terrific when they're able to be used. But the second part is getting your hands on your own tissue. You have a right to it. Getting out of a pathology department sometimes can be trickier than other times, and getting it sent, and getting sent where you want it to go. Who do you want to be testing it? How many markers do you want to be tested for? Those sorts of things are conversations to have.
Thank you very much. I see Marion's at the mic. Marion.
I have several questions. One of them is, we know that late diagnosis eliminates the majority of our patients from inclusion in clinical trials. Now, we do have very few people who are early diagnosed. So how do you address those people that are generally coming in at stage 4?
For us, stage 4 is pretty common. That's typically when we hear from folks. Absolutely. It's the reason we want to connect with somebody the moment they're diagnosed, so that they understand how the time frame is going to play out. And I've had 6 family members with cancer. I've got a 7th loved one diagnosed right now, managing, and even in my own family, I've had trouble conveying that concept of a clinical trial is not something to consider at the very last minute. It's something to consider and understand up front, so that you know what you can be eligible for, what not. You also understand what decisions you're going to make are going to leave you eligible or not along the way.
So when you're talking about 7 or 8 patients, are you talking specifically about cholangiocarcinoma patients?
We've worked with patients with all types of cancers, and including bile duct cancers.
Yeah, that's the real issue with our patients, that they are not like the other patients, and we rarely have early diagnosis. Secondly, when you were talking about clinical trials, and yes, we would like patients to be in clinical trials for all the reasons that you're mentioning. The problem with it is that in very few, I think I've read of 3, and I've worked with clinical trials, have been for the last 10 years, is that you have to fail a prior treatment. And so with that is what Andy certainly can relate to. We're hoping that in the future that will be eliminated, and then the clinical trial will be the first place that patients will have to look. But at this point, in order to enroll in a trial, they have to go through that first step. So do you address that?
Absolutely. That's often the case, but not always the case, and it's shifting. There was a time when a phase 1 trial, you wouldn't want it, and you certainly wouldn't want it till it was you'd really exhausted all other options. now with targeted therapies and immunotherapies, you want to look at them sooner, and those concepts are becoming basically knock on the door anyway.
Correct.
Those are getting closer to opening up
Right. So
sooner.
patients are made aware of that.
Andy, you had a comment?
And
Sorry,
actually,
Martin.
just to add on to that, we're finding that those trials, the ones that are shifting earlier in patients' care, are coming to us because those patients are kind of hard to find because they're not really looking for trials. They're kind of going through the motions of normal care, and so it's become a special mission for us to try to identify more of those patients for those trials that are trying to go earlier in a person's care.
Yeah, and that's the third issue that I have with this is that, clinical trials are conducted on the healthiest of the patients. So with our cancer, that's something to consider, though we always want to look at the option for a clinical trial, but that they're aware that they do have to undergo a certain treatment. And that's changing a little bit. I know that the TAPER study, I'm on the molecular board on that they're starting to ask physicians to give their opinion. I mean, do you really want to have this patient fail? And if you don't feel you do, then we are allowing that. But that's a slow process, and I don't expect this to be really fully engaged within the next 2 to 3 years. But anyway, I love your services. Thank you.
I think, Marion, to just address that issue, one more thing is that sometimes a clinical trial won't be effective because a patient has already been exposed to a treatment or several treatments. And so that trial isn't effective. Yet you can't participate in the trial till you've done those treatments. And so you're kind of caught in this catch-22 kind of thing. Unfortunately, I think that's a product of how the system is designed. And that's when one thing about clinical trials is that I wouldn't characterize it necessarily as a conflict of interest, but I would say sometimes there is a misalignment of interest between the researchers and the patients. And what I mean by that is researchers are conducting the trials, and their focus is collecting quality data and conducting good, sound research that's not compromised in order to perhaps get some kind of new therapy out there. And if they can help a patient while they're doing that, that's great. That's their interest. The patient looks at it from the other way. I want to be treated. I want to be eradicated from cancer. I want cancer eradicated from my body. And if you can get some research out of it, that's great. It's when those two worlds collide is when we have these situations where, well, you can't do this therapy because you haven't exhausted chemotherapy yet. I don't know how to address that yet.
Correct.
Other than, again, that's one of the reasons I wanted to create a message board of sorts, is to let people know that, hey, consider this before you do that. Consider this trial before you do that therapy. Before you get something as simple as a biopsy. A biopsy may have an influence on how you're going to respond to a clinical trial. There's so many different things out there, and we're not capturing that. We're not capturing that as a community to learn from a person in Seattle's experience, and the person in Florida is recreating and doing the same thing all over again. That's where I think we can as a community can start learning from each other. I think there's lots of room for improvement in that regard.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Kimberly.
Okay. A couple questions. First, is there a cost to the patients to enroll in any of these services? And second, could you guys address the genomic profiling, the mutations, what they test for? Because a lot of the patients sometimes will say, well, I don't have any mutations, or I have 1, or I have 26, and to know that those change throughout the course of their disease, like you said. And so when you're testing for that profile, are you only looking for the targeted therapies that are already available, or are you going to do the complete whole exome, whole genome, I don't know how that works, and keep that on file in case something comes up later down the road?
So our solution to that is twofold. No, service is absolutely free and absolutely confidential. patient family centric. There are a number of different testing services out there. So Foundation Medicine is one that we're partnered with, and if you're using their service and you get your test results, you'll see a phone number on there, and that's us processing those calls for them. The question is how many you were tested for, and from our point of view, yes, we want to know. And for my family members, I want to know every piece of data there is to know now. And even if there's nothing to apply it to today, maybe there's something to apply it to tomorrow. So yeah, we will also look back, recontact you if something pops up for which you had a marker or you had an alteration that popped on one of your test results. And I can't emphasize enough, all of this is moving fast. So without giving false hope, I think there's hope, and there is a lot of progress to be made with pressure. Peer pressure works, voices work. So the idea of clinical trials, for example, being designed that require you to have failed a chemotherapy first, it won't be hard to get past that with targeted therapies. They're coming very quickly into a point where is it ethical to withhold from somebody a targeted therapy when they've been shown to have a marker. You do need to ask about the cost of testing. You don't want to be surprised by that, and as Martin said, there are lots of organizations have come up with ways to help support that, and the companies doing the testing will also, although they'll sometimes be a little quiet about it, they'll work with you on that. So do keep that in mind as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Final question.
Sorry, I just need to answer as well. There's no charge to use CureFlow.
Okay, that was one of my questions. The other one is on the molecular profiling and the clinical profile. What does that cost, and where do you get that done?
From us, it's just you answering questions. Now, the molecular test, the genomic test, you need a testing company. And Martin's mentioned some they've partnered with, and there's lots out there. And sometimes your physicians are at institutions that do their own testing. The clinical profile, that's just us asking you questions. What is your diagnosis, your stage, your treatment history, and some aspects that are very specific to bile duct cancers that are germane to knowing which trials you might be eligible for. And again, there's going to be sort of two sets of trials. One set that's targeting your specific diagnosis, and because it's a rare diagnosis, there's fewer trials that are targeting just that, for business reasons as much as anything else. And then there are hundreds of other targeted or immunotherapies that are being tested for anybody with a solid tumor, and you may want to, those may be of interest along the way. But again, we just need the information from you, and we also want to make sure you know how to talk about it, so that you understand what those pieces are, so that you can both maybe have better conversations with your own treatment team and with the clinical trial site. Because again, it's only the clinical trial site that can actually offer you a place to enroll, and they are happy to talk to you first about whether the trial really is right for you. So we'll help you just literally kind of assemble your own story, if you will, so you can have those conversations.
Okay, and the other thing is this something that we can do as a preemptive strike? Like, I was treated, I'm not under treatment right now, but if it was to come back, would it hurt to have all my stuff on file with you?
I'm sure that's the perfect time. Now is the perfect time to do that, exactly.
Okay, thank you. Oh.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about with patients who are a little bit early maybe for a clinical trial. We still help them build up their medical profile. There are two questions about molecular profiling test costs and medical profile gathering. I can speak to those as well just really quickly. The cost for molecular profiling, there are some scary looking test prices out there, but it's important to know that these test providers are very interested in working with you to make sure that their tests are accessible to you. And every test provider that we're aware of has assistance programs that bring these tests down to very affordable levels. So regarding medical profile, I'll actually confess a mistake that I made as I started the company, which is that we set up a website, and it's kind of it would be automagical, that people would, enter information that we could match with clinical trial parameters from trials.gov. Turned out we were totally wrong on both sides. So the trials.gov stuff is all incorrect. And on the patient side, asking them for the information was a start. But it turned out that as we presented those profiles to trial sponsors, we kept getting turned down. And it was frustrating. It was frustrating for patients, but our team was getting demoralized. It was terrible. And so what we actually did is we realized that the same HIPAA data access rights that we apply from molecular information also pertain to medical health record information, and that there are standardized health data formats like a CCD file, which is a continuity of care document, that we can request for on a patient's behalf with the patient's request demand letter. So we do that now. For every patient, we collect their medical record. And what we've realized is that the core of what we have to do is build the world-class medical and molecular profile, because the ultimate decision maker in whether you get into a trial is the investigator at the site. And if your profile isn't as good as the profile that they're looking at for the patient that is actually their patient, they're going to say, well, this patient's half qualified, or not as good. And so we've risen our bar for that. It was a painful process because of my mistake. I caused a lot of pain. And we're there now. We're getting a lot closer, I would say, where these profiles are now respected by the investigators who are receiving them, and we're getting those patient invitations, which were so hard to get for a very long time for us.
Thank you very much. The whole panel is going to be around for the rest of the evening, so feel free to drop in and ask them any further questions. So panel, you're released. Thank you very much.